This is a talk and a tribute to the great works of Walter Russell and Russellian science. If you've never heard of Walter Russell, it's time that you do, especially if you're a scientist. It would behoove anyone of any frame of mind and any particular creed to study the works of Walter Russell. I can guarantee you that it will be enlightening. Hello everyone, welcome back to Still Point Radio. This is your host Mrryanmcmahon. Happy to be back. Good evening, good day, good morning, good night, wherever you may be. Buckle up. As usual, we're going to create some conscious content, stuff that changes the world. I have here today Matt Presti, the president of the University of Science and Philosophy in Waynesboro, Virginia, a university dedicated to Russellian science, named after Walter Russell, a great scientist as well as philosopher, sculptor, luminary, and artist. I also have with me the university's lead scientist. His name is Darren Colomb. We're going to talk about the nature of the universe, the nature of motion, the incandescence of light, the cubic waveform model, whether or not electrons, protons, and atoms actually exist. We'll even go into Maxwell's field equations and discover whether or not they are aberrations of the human mind or whether they actually exist in the real world. And it's going to take some courage. So, quoting the great psychiatrist and psychologist Thomas Szasz, clear thinking requires not intelligence but courage, Thomas Szasz. Quoting the great philosopher Johannes Wolfgang von Goethe, seeing is how we perceive. Science, by nature, is a paradox. The goal is to balance our outer sight with inner sight, nucleate our own opposites. That's how we solve this paradox. We'll also go into what it is to be genius, where genius comes from, and how, as human beings, we can access it. So this is an incredible talk. We're going to unlock some of those doors and open up some of the perceptive abilities in the mind, the intuitive faculties that actually make a great scientist as well as a great philosopher. So, here we go. Into creation mechanics and meta science. So, welcome Matt Presti and welcome Darren Colomb.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
You're welcome. I wanted to start off kind of what we were just talking about is just we're going to take people, the way I see this, we're going to take people into language that may be foreign to them. So, I'm going to just there's going to be things I want to talk about, like certain terms like still magnetic light, the nature of motion, and the cubic waveform model. I think a lot of people have never even heard of still magnetic light or the cubic waveform. And these are the things I feel are going to potentially change our physics paradigm and change our science paradigm for a greater future for our children's children's, because the way that I look at and understand Walter Russell that was so inspiring to me is that it's a science that is verifiable and testable here on planet Earth, and it's reflected in nature. And so if we have a science that's reflected in nature and we can actually test it here on Earth, it's going to be more balanced and less entropy based. So what I mean by that is that we're not using fossil fuels in the future for our energy source and disrupting the equilibrium of Mother Nature and the Earth. So the first question for either one of you guys is, can you guys describe just in general the cubic waveform model and how it's different from the atomic theory, or I guess you'd say quantum mechanics, quantum physics?
Well, quantum mechanics is it's one half of a so-called unifying theory, one that describes small scale, and then there's general relativity that describes large scale, and they're trying to smash these two together, and they don't play well. So really, what we're dealing with Russell science is something much more close to what I call creation mechanics, or just how anything in the universe is created, even the universe itself. So it's very much beyond any kind of theoretical assertion or theoretical musings poking around at things at the small scale and things at the large scale. It's actually one set of mechanics that describes how everything comes into being, not just small particles or large particles, right? Um, Dr. Russell called this a cubic wave field model, in that there's nothing in creation other than waves, light waves specifically, and these waves are bounded by planes of zero curvature and internal planes of zero curvature, which subdivide one cube into eight, giving us eight plus a centering zero, which is nine, and nothing in nature ever exceeds nine. There's nine octaves in his periodic table, which displays elements that were previously never discovered, but were verified later and given different names by the people who supposedly discovered them. So it's a very different way of looking at the universe. It dispels a lot of the theoretical aspects that academics are trying to get at, and really gets to the source of putting together all the best aspects of spirituality and science. It really brings the two of them together into one consistent cosmology.
Beautifully, that's well said. Creation mechanics. That's a great way to describe it. I love that. I wanted to sort of ask you, when I hear that word creation mechanics, it reminds me of the Hermetic principles, and the first one being as above, so below, or as within, so without. So if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is this this trying to pair these two theories together, and they're not playing well. What you were saying earlier is kind of like denying the first Hermetic principle, if you will, of everything in the cosmos that's on a large scale is being patterned and organized in the exact same way by the exact same universal force on the small and microcosmic scale. Does that sort of work for what you're saying?
Yeah, in other words, when you look at an atom, for instance, an atom of carbon, if you were to visualize it, all you have to do is look up into the heavens and look at a spiral galaxy, and you'll see the exact same formation. In fact, every nucleal center is not exactly a solid mass. There's only one instance in the wave in which that's actually true, and that's at carbon, or what we call the wave amplitude. It's where if you imagine a sinusoid, it's where the crest and the trough is located. At that position, you've accumulated maximum potential by compression from the outside to the inside. And so it isn't a nuclear mass in the way that they teach it, where all elements have a nuclear mass full of protons and neutrons of a certain weight with orbital electrons around it. What Russell is really endeavoring to teach us is that there's a wave structure behind all so-called particles or particulate. A particle mass is really only an accumulation of waves in a smaller volume or smaller region of space. And so based on all of our test equipment and what we have available to us to our limited senses, it appears to be a particle mass. And that's what led to this whole explosion of trying to describe everything using particles. But in reality, it's the underlying mechanics behind everything is waves. Everything has a wave structure because everything is created and it lives. It has a life and death cycle, and that is fundamentally based upon the structure of the wave.
Yes. So in the wave, of course, when things are moving in waves and in wave fields, you constantly have um, this balance, right? And the balance, if I understand it correctly, the balance in nature is like moving through, or well, this is a big question too, motion. But for all intents and purposes, I'll say moving through fields of space. So is that what we would call like a field perturbation?
Well, a field, so the best way, and I've answered this a few times about fields, but fields have everything to do with your mind. When you throw a ball up in the air, you put a certain amount of your own impetus into that ball, right, in order to make it move. And
Uh-huh.
that's an action, right? The ball leaves your hand. And then when it hits a point of suspension where it completely stops and it hangs in midair. That's another reversal point. That's the boundary of one wave field, and you've defined the extension, the amount of that wave field with your mind because you extended a certain amount of energy, and then that energy runs out of gas, and then it stops, and then it reverses and it comes back to your hand. So every wave field has everything to do with the amount of desire that you have. So in essence, we aren't aware of this with our limitations of being human, but there's you could say there's a wave field that encompasses the entire universe.
Right.
Uh, and then there's subsequently smaller wave fields within that, all the way down to infinity. So it goes in infinitely large and infinitely small, but it has everything to do with your mind.
That's amazing. I mean, so many people, I think, in the scientific community, being just primarily left brain, materialist, reductionist, are not typically are not going to allow themselves to even use the term mind with science. And so this is a huge mistake, obviously, because if I'm hearing you correctly, the fields that are basically created by the desire of our mind are just what we would say in philosophical terms like ways of seeing or ways of perceiving. So if people can accept and can go into this more holistic view of physics and science, they're going to be able to move out of their left brain and into their right brain, and um, I think hopefully be able to see things not from a sort of armchair theory approach, but to see things like from their own, if you will, from their own center. Things would be like balanced, like they themselves are in the center of the universe, so to speak, because we are dictating our own reality to some degree, or at least the way we perceive reality. Does that does that sound correct?
Yeah, well, everyone is the the lord of their own universe, I guess you would say. We everybody's looking out and seeing some kind of reality that they're witnessing, but really it's all vibratory motion. And vibratory motion is an extension from a fulcrum. And the important thing to realize is that you are that fulcrum. You are that fulcrum, and you as self is also God. God is the same thing, and that's why I say it's really mind. When I hesitate to use the word God, because especially in a science discussion,
Right.
because there's a trend or a fashion to be sort of an atheist when you're in the sciences, to not really tread into the ground of what the soul is, what the self is. But to me, that's kind of the wrong direction. You want to go in that direction because you can't have a good science without answering some very fundamental metaphysical questions, philosophical questions. So I think one of the reasons this is a university of science and philosophy is that the science needs the philosophy and the philosophy needs the science.
Yes, yeah, and that's something that I talk about a lot, because I'm heavily into etymology and into words, and one of the things I bring up to people when I talk is the word science itself, and I connect it to the word conscience. So con meaning with, and science, referring to sentience or self-awareness, and it's so odd when I bring this up to people. They never realize that the root word in which we get science has to do with not your outer perception of the world, but it starts with your subjectivity, your inner perception of the world. So I always tell people, science is actually a philosophy, and you guys, following up the work of Walter Russell, have brought this together in a University of Science and Philosophy, and it's so important that people understand and see that all of our our theories and our approaches, they come from the mind of man, or you could even go further, like you said, from his inner light or from his soul. So I think it's just amazing that we have scientists like yourself that are just going, look, this is not just my spiritual, particular spiritual belief, but this is the way nature is reflecting it as well. This idea of the fulcrum, and the balance of things. If I could, I mean, I know we could go in so many different directions with this, but I wanted to kind of read from Walter Russell's book, Secret of Light. So let's see here. This is page 134. It's The Desire for Balance. Walter Russell, The Secret of Light. All things seek balance. Two opposed, unbalanced halves of one are forever seeking to balance their opposition. Two children on a seesaw are balanced when they are on a level with their centering fulcrum. And when they are on two different levels, they are then unbalanced in their centering fulcrum. They are then dynamic. The fulcrum no longer centers them, although they are balanced in themselves. In such a position, the key that they are obliged to move. Repetition of their motion is impossible while they are in balance and with their fulcrum, but it is imperative when the fulcrum no longer centers them. So, I mean, hopefully that sort of points to what we're talking about, is that, like you said a second ago, that each person is the center of their universe, and that each person acts as a fulcrum as they move through reality.
Yeah, it's very well said. And even movement. One thing that maybe people can try is when you're going for a walk or something, try to figure out if you're moving or if the world is moving around you and you're staying put. Is there any way to tell that one is more correct than the other? And this will begin to get your mind comfortable with the various illusions of motion. But really, what we have is when I say creation mechanics, it's a way of taking a quality, an idea, a thing which is not manifested physically, but rather is just a concept, and the way in which mind divides one static condition into two dynamic conditions to allow it to set it in motion. Just like you can take a film reel and you know that you're holding in that reel, say it's Hamlet, you know that the entire story, the entire play, the concept, the idea of Hamlet is within that one canister, within that one reel. But then you take it out and you set it in motion, you put it on a reel and move it past a light, and now you project it, and now you have the idea of a continuity, of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's very much what God does in order to simulate his one idea of love into the entirety of creation, the entire universe, all of the people, all of everything, quite literally everything, is done in that manner. So it's a very powerful way to look at what the universe is, and your relation to it, most importantly.
Yeah, the relation to it. I think that's what we're getting at, is like how one relates to their inner self and, of course, their outer self. So, so I also, speaking of motion, I've made a couple videos out of Walter Russell's work, mostly where I'm just reading and quoting from him, and then trying to break it down in my kind of language, more layman language. And one of the ones I get the most feedback on is whether or not this concept of whether or not motion really exists, or maybe another way to say it is that whether or not light is actually moving. So if we were to ask you that, Darren, if light is supposed to be the fastest thing in the universe, and the universe is boundless, so there's no box containing it, there's no boundaries, how can something infinite and boundless be moving at all? I mean, wouldn't it be
It's a
still?
good question. It would be still. This is the power of understanding polarity, because you can't have motion without non-motion, can you? In other words, you
Right.
can't set anything in motion unless something does not move. Just like if you were in pure black empty space, there's no way to tell if you were standing still or moving. But if an object moves past you, now you have a reference point to say that I'm moving in respect to this object, or the flip side is that the object is moving relative to you. So with light, we have these kinds of illusions. We have when things are seemingly in motion, we have the illusions of continuities in a linear time flow. But really, to make that illusion what it is, you have to void it. Everything in the universe is voided as it occurs, and then it is repeated as it is voided. That's one of Russell's laws of thermodynamics, that basically nothing does move, but we ignore half of a wave cycle. Our senses are limited, and they only allow us to see the radiative half of the cycle, the death half. This is what led to the idea of entropy, which really dominates the thinking of our scientists today. So really, the limitation of the senses gives us what we experience as our linear sense of time, and this is all achieved by motion. So it can be a bit confusing for the student getting acquainted with Russell to realize that, okay, all matters is an illusion of motion. But then you read at some point in his work that also that the motion itself is an illusion because everything is voided back to zero. So everything comes from zero and returns to zero. So it's a bit of a mind bender, but the more you stick with it, the more it becomes comfortable, and the more you realize that it's really the limitation of our senses, which it gives us the beautiful illusion of things moving in time.
Gotcha. So okay, so that sparks a couple things with me. First, our the limitations of our senses also translates to me as the limitation of our language or our ability to articulate it. And this is where I fall short a lot, where I can read Walter Russell or listen to you guys, listen to your work when you speak, and I can track with it. And I go, okay, I got it. Like I get it. I can feel it. To some degree that my perception is centered and is correct. It's an intuitive feeling. However, a couple moments later, when I try to articulate it with, the words that we use in the English language, I always feel the limits of my syntax, or, my where I'm jumping off from, my approach to language. So I think a lot of people get hung up, myself included, where we have to use words like motion in a sentence to basically describe that there is no motion. It's like sort of that one of those weird sort of looping catch 22s. Would you agree with that? I mean, you're very good at articulating this, but does language hold us back to some degree when describing these very deep metaphysical concepts?
Absolutely. I am a big fan of Alan Watts, and he
Oh
would
yeah.
discuss this topic quite a bit about how language is so limiting, and you're it's just like what I was saying before, where you have a concept, and that mind the concept occurs within the mind, and then you have to give it a body form. And the easiest, the most readily available way to do that is to speak it. But now you have to divide, you have to separate that concept into discrete bits of information in order to simulate it, in order to give it, in order to begin speaking and try to make a point when you're finished.
Right.
So
Right.
science is definitely a language, and it different. We try to get all on the same page and have standard definitions, but when we're dealing with Russell science, it's very important to know that we need to relearn and redefine certain words to fit a two-way moving universe rather than a one-way moving universe. So, for instance, entropy existing on its own is not possible. It must have an equal and opposite reactionary force, which you might have to make up a word and say it's centropic now, or now you're in a position where you have to make up words because the concept which led to the initial set of words is no longer adequate.
Well, it's one thing to make up words, which I think is important because our language needs to evolve, and it's another thing to make up theories. Like, well, I mean, I've got to call out Einstein. I mean, um, based on everything that I've read of Einstein, it's very, very little of it is sound. Very little of it is verifiable and testable, and we have all these theories that exist from literally from an armchair, right? So that you can't actually test. Like one person's here on the ground, and they're holding a watch at the same time as someone else in a rocket ship 20 light years away, and we're supposed to be able to test this, right? But the laboratory is non-existent in this situation. So I think that what's beautiful about Russell's work is that, and hopefully it's okay if I basically call him this. Would you guys agree that Russell is a hermeticist at heart, or in his basic teachings?
I would think of Russell as a three-dimensional alchemist slash hermeticist. In basic alchemy, you have the circle and the square, where Russell was able to transmute that two-dimensional teaching into a three-dimensional cube and sphere, which, you could trace the human mind back a couple thousand years and say that we were entirely two-dimensional in our thinking. Yet, to gain new stratums of awareness, you have to move beyond the conception of matter as being particles and more into the wave nature of creation, which, when you create waves of three dimensionality, you begin to see a concept of the universe unfold that is more in tune with nature. So yeah, the hermeticists of the old days dealt with the square and the circle, but what's so interesting about Russell is he three-dimensionalized the wave. And if you know that science still uses a two-dimensional chalkboard sine wave to try to teach how waves actually move in spirals, you're limited to that two-dimensional surface. So he gives you a way of thinking about matter that is three-dimensional. And it takes a lot of practice. I mean, it's a language in itself, as you said earlier, consciousness or science from the Latin "scio" means to know. And all these past 2,000 years, we've done is try to sense the universe and reason it into a sensible existence. You can't reason love into existence. There's no experiment you can do to prove that, you love your wife or you love your mother, but you can certainly know whether or not you do. And some things are just better known than they are, sensed. And so it takes eons for man's mind to unfold from a limited sense-based perception to a knowing that transcends the senses. But then at the same time, as you learn to know what it is you're dealing with, you become more able and apt to predict or to know what is going to be the outcome. So the need for experimentation is basically excluded at that point. You begin to operate from the fulcrum, which is the power source of the seesaw of your hemispheres of your own body, brain. And in that sense, you achieve that mind spatiality equilibrium where all power is available to you, all knowledge. And so you're moving in a sense into that new paradigm where the knower becomes the producer of sensed effects. So it becomes quite purposeful at that point. And I'd like to comment real quickly too. You mentioned about philosophy, and with the University of Science and Philosophy, I truly do understand why the Russells named it that, is because philosophy is literally the root of science. It was the great existentialists who asked the questions, who am I, why am I here, that led to, the entire scientific method. So you can't just hack off the tree and claim that it's separate from the root. It's the very philosophy of life and the questioners of reality that drove science into existence. So one is actually the embodiment of the other. And as far as Hermeticism goes, yeah, it's Russell's science and philosophy is like a three-dimensional alchemy slash Hermeticism.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's got my head spinning. That's a great answer. Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I hope more and more people will understand what you just said. Understand that there is a knowing, and that science, you know, is centered in the mind, or in you could say in philosophy, the love of wisdom, and that there is a purpose to it, and the purpose is to balance all people. I think instead of just creating technology that we use for sort of a profit model and destroy the earth and people and our bodies in the process, we should look to science as a way, like the Tao, like a way, the way to uh, know our purpose, the way to center our lives, the way to commune with nature, the way to be, right?
Absolutely. In today's world, so many people seek to give their little bit of power that they have away to some external authority, which is what gives the state its rising tide of power. It seems to want to provide people with zero effort, some reward for no effort at all. And it's, in a sense, it's why the Russells were opposed to communism in every way, shape, and form, because really nature doesn't act on a communist model. It acts on more or less a holarchical. Those things in nature that are purposeful, that do the work required of that individual creation, say a bird or even a fish, if it acts in accord with its design, it lives a purposeful life, and it has lasting continuity throughout its life. Now you have this model of, you know, people can just sit around and get handed things and expect to find happiness from that. It's just not in tune with nature. Nothing in nature doesn't work and still survives. But that's one of the conundrums we find ourselves in terms of politics and what is the best road forward. But just to know enough that nature creates purposeful things that must act in accord with natural law to create balance in the life of that species or that individual life form. Nature's very correct that anything that does not act in accord with its design actually begins to destroy itself. And some could say it should, because
Right.
if a tree leans too far off a cliff, it's going to topple into the chasm. Just like man's civilization, if it runs amok and is out of balance, it's going to meet a fateful end. And you can look at the evidence of that. There's been 21 civilizations that have fallen due to imbalanced human relations, either between the haves and the have-nots or some other imbalanced action. And so always the have-nots will want to take from those who have, and that creates the situation for things like communism to rise and become powerful. And again, it's delicate. If we truly understood how nature continues, how it has such continuity, we would base our own civilization off of that. And that's one of the unique aspects of the philosophy of the Russells, the living philosophy, is that they knew the electrifying power of man-woman balance. To assume that a government could run a human home is absurd. To think that a woman could run it all by herself, or that a man could run it all by himself. It takes really two to create balance in nature. And the male and the female of every species does an equal amount of work in some way, shape, or form to assure the continuity of its own self, to reproduce the idea of that self eternally. So we see continuity in nature, but with man trying to be both mother and father to the world, we've seen one civilization fall after another. And it's wise of Leo to say that, if woman were to be the sole power source of the world and try to run the world all by herself, it would end in just as much of a disaster as it would if man himself tried to run the entire world. So we have yet to understand how the balance of male and female plays equally into the continuity of nature. And it's something that will require probably centuries of thinking to understand. But that balance actually begins within each human being, as well as each individual entity of nature. To perform its role as it was designed is to live within continuity and the eternal qualities of the mind source from which it springs.
Wow. Yep. Well, well said again. I love the term you used in a few times in other your past interviews, where you call that process where man is trying to walk that delicate balance. You call it the human relations pollution, where people are unwillingly and unconsciously polluting themselves by, I would say, by just agreeing with the status quo or the mediocrity of society, going after what your neighbors say you should go after because they saw it on television or whatnot. And that's really I think what we're getting at. I mean, if the world could actually shift into this type of science, uh, which would be a shift in consciousness, obviously. I mean, there's so many things that could change. I mean, obviously the most basic would be we would no longer be digging up fossil fuels and having an entropy based way of living. But just the centering of things, just the way we could be. I mean, I can't even imagine just so much. We could have everything that we have now. We could have all the technologies that work, that make our lives convenient. But I think it would be brilliant if everyone knew that with those technologies, they have a bit of purpose. They have a bit of responsibility each day in their lives. And what you just said kind of makes me, I have these conversations and I'll talk about something philosophical, and a lot of people go, they go, why do I need to know that? Like, why are you telling me that? They listen to it. They go, that's a nice idea, but how does it affect me in my life? Why do I need to know that? And then they just look down and they go back to their phone. And it's like, if you don't realize that you need to have a centered way of being in the world, and you don't, you need to walk with some sort of purpose, and you need to be able to feel the harmony that exists in nature. I mean, I don't know how to help you if you're not even already aware that there is something beyond you going on here. There's the spirit, if you want to call it that. There's the netters from the Egyptian tradition, the cosmic forces of nature. It's just like, it's so strange to me that it's like people have been really, really turned off. Like our ontology is oftology, like people are just not everybody, but the humdrum of society, the things that just keep us getting up out of bed every day tend to grind our spirituality away. So, yeah, I mean, I'm so happy that I found this work. I'm going to have to study it a lot more to fully understand it. But I think what you guys are doing is necessary and brilliant, and more people should hear about it.
I appreciate that. No,
Yeah.
it isn't called the great work of the self without due reason.
Right.
It's
Right.
the least, it's the path least taken. It's that middle road, where everybody else is on that wide path toward mediocrity. Very few will do the homework or do the work of self-introspection, which is absolutely required to even begin to get on this path. I mean, that's really what it takes. You have to, and sometimes the best way to get on that path is to just smash the bottom as hard as you can. In my own personal life, I had to hit bottom so hard that at that point, I contemplated suicide or self-betterment, and I chose self-betterment. But either way, those are kind of good experiences, because if they lead you to a higher purpose, they lead you to try to work on the self, to create yourself, recreate yourself again and again, to learn to unfold the natural talents that lay innate within your character. And it really all comes down to character building. I mean, this is what the Twilight Club, which was the original impetus for Walter and Leo to create the University of Science and Philosophy, was because that club of poets, which included Herbert Spencer, Alexis Carrel, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, various other luminaries of the fine arts and things like that, they saw that around the change of the 20th century, and some 20 years before when they first met, that human civilization, as it was budding into this industrial age, the character of man was beginning to slip because of everything that was being made easier. You have these machines now doing the work that men used to do by hand, so they felt that in the industrialization, man's soul would become industrialized and lose its sense of purpose and lose its sense of self. And here we are today looking out and seeing that there's a world of machines that are going to replace humans. We're in a spiritual crisis, honestly.
Yeah.
And, all these things that tend to peak around this time, war, disease, are all effects of that crisis. So, again, that crisis also helps create the need to solve that problem. And they say necessity is the mother of all invention. Well, there's a certain necessity that you see the spiritual teachings of so many different modalities around the world coming to the forefront now. And so you have these great philosophical debates occurring in podcast after podcast across the planet, where the mainstream, basically, or what is the dinosaur media, I would say, is in its final death throes. Nobody's getting anything spiritual out of that anymore, so they're seeking new alternative avenues of information, which are coming to the forefront. And this kind of media will become the new media. It is the new media. It already is, I should say. And, I think everyone, I've said this before, everyone should become their own media. And media, the very word, means a form of cultivation, conveyance, or expression. And what is your form of conveyance? What is your culture? What is your expression? Culture isn't just about tradition. It's about recreating the traditions. And so many of us have so many kinds of blood from so many different kinds of places. But what is the real culture? What is it we're trying to create here that betters human society? I think we're in a great time of spiritual introspection, and that's great for the human race. And a lot of good can come from that. So it's important to keep in mind that though the world seems to be on fire and everything seems to be moving toward hell at the same time, there's an equal and opposite of those who are coming to the fruition of what it means to be human, those who are recreating and rebranding and reinvestigating and reorganizing so that we can, find ways to work ourselves out of this conundrum. There's an equal impetus for solution as much as there is for recognizing the problem. And that's great to see. It's going to be a hard road, but what road was easy? And if I look back at my own life, the hard times I had made me who I am, and I wouldn't trade them for the world. And I think that, as human beings, we'll appreciate that same hard work that it took to develop the kind of character that can lead us into the real new age, which is a leap in consciousness that takes about 300 years to achieve.
Right. Yeah. If somebody else is creating your culture, then you're not, right? So everyone should be able to, I like that, to be able to take control, or control is maybe not the right word, but to engage in their own selfhood, their own development. And so that kind of leads me to, this is another philosophical question, I know, and then we'll have to ask a more scientific question after this, but you might have already kind of just nailed it, but I want to bring it out there anyway. Russell had a statement about genius where, basically he would say, like, mediocrity is self-inflicted and genius is self-created. Can you speak on that a little bit? That this idea that each person actually, within them has the ability, or has the potential ability, to be their own genius.
Indeed. The quote was, mediocrity is self-inflicted, genius is self-bestowed.
Yes.
The Russell said over and over in the writings throughout that there are no accidentally great people, that in order to become great, a man or woman has to choose and decide and take actions and make things happen in a series of steps to achieve that greatness. And we look around at the world, and of course the dinosaur media, the old media, likes to tell us that Einstein was great. Every university hallway has a poster of Einstein, but yet what did he actually make in physical reality besides a concrete refrigerator, which never caught on?
Right.
Ultimately, a genius produces a prodigious amount of work. There's attributes to genius. They tend to want to work alone. They prefer not to work in groups. because it stifles their creativity, which is another reason why communism will never produce a strain of geniuses, because you can't, out of a mob, garner anything more than destruction, which is why mob rule is a dangerous thing, and it should be relegated to the past in terms of human betterment. But the genius, what's amazing about them is that they're often misunderstood, but they tend to be the progenitors of massive change in the human world. I mean, if you just take Tesla alone and his creations, which elevated the human race into the actual beginnings of the New Age. The New Age was actually called the New Age because of electricity. That's the root of the actual New Age.
Yep.
Not this, late 1960s drug using cult of hippies, which everybody's been through the hippie thing, I guess you could say, but that's not the New Age. With people touring at $400 a seminar to get you closer to, that's the false New Age, if you will. The New Age is the age of electricity. It was when man lit the night sky and drove terror away from his cities and his homes with light. So we brought light to the world, the new age of electricity. And it sort of got stifled. I mean, we were hit, blindsided, by the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and the so-called the banking, the Rothschilds and all that stuff. That's all to stifle and funnel man's talents and efforts into somebody's pocketbook. So we're coming to the end of that paradigm, but it's important that as we move forward, we don't lose sight of working on what is really important, and that's the expression of yourself, your true purpose. And the Russells really felt with their teaching the home study course, which is the flagship curriculum of the USP, the purpose of it was to help you unfold your innate talents through the discovery of yourself, which is, the creator within you, to learn to take from the stillness and the silence and the equilibrium within yourself the inspiration that comes to be able to create bodies and create purposeful living for yourself, to achieve, the genius within, to unfold it. So it's more or less a study course of how to do exactly that, to unfold the genius within you and to give it to the world for the betterment of all humanity.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, the word genius, there's a lot of roots to it, but for me, it mostly refers to gender or to generate, that constant round and around and around movement in nature of progress. And in this case, the progress that you so eloquently just described, the progress of consciousness. I'm not a big fan of Einstein, and I totally agree with you. But I think he had maybe one moment of genius, and it's encapsulated in this quote. So I'm going to read it. This is a quote from Albert Einstein. You can imagine that I look back at my life's work with calm satisfaction, but from nearby it looks quite different. There is not a single concept of which I am convinced that it will stand firm, and I feel uncertain whether I am in general on the right track. So there's Albert Einstein, in his moment of maybe honesty and centered genius, where he goes, everything I've done is potentially wrong and probably wrong, and yet he's still propped up as our greatest scientist, or one of our greatest scientists, our greatest physicists. And I think it's just a shame and a sham that not to deface him as a person, but to deface the establishment for just using him as a profit generator, like you said.
That's well said. And two, if you look like the Alfred Whiteheads and others who were the progenitors of the current science movement of materialism, all in their papers, the Heideggers and Schrodinger, admitted at the end of their cursory examination of materiality that, there's something that's creating this that's even beyond their perception. So they hinted and alluded that basically everything they had helped to solidify in terms of materialistic science was unfounded. and needed more examination, that there's a universal power source or mind, if you will, that's all pervading, that creates this. But yet the powers that never were ran with the materialism story because it serves them to externalize the human soul, to want to chase things outside of itself. And that could be any of the seven deadly sins, down to people lining up at a Walmart at 5 a.m. to stomp each other to death on a Black Friday. So yeah, I mean, it's imperative too that we recognize that we've been sold only part of the actuality of what's really going on, and that is to look outside of yourself. Everything is geared toward the bells and the whistles and the loud noises and the distractions and the commercials and the shows and the programs and the programming. But it's so enlightening and comforting to have, a media that's coming into existence to replace what is false. At least people are out there questioning and willing to take a second look at things, just like the science of materialism, which so many people now, compared to just 5 years ago, there's thousands, perhaps millions more people questioning that paradigm. And that's what leads to new discoveries, is when you question, when you go, I wonder if what they're saying is right anymore. And it's that, that very foundation of trying to, find a better interpretation, or at least try to interpret it for yourself.
Right.
That's who says we're done experimenting? Who says we're done, with testing new concepts? And it is indeed a concept that creates a body, whether it be a piece of art, a painting, a poem, a symphony, a rock song, a jazz tune. That concept is unfolded through the action of thinking, but the concept itself has no body and is lifeless. And everybody has great concepts all throughout their life. It's just the difference between genius and mediocrity is genius takes the chance and builds the body for it. That's really all it is. It's a simple choice.
I have to agree with that. And would you say that pretty much all geniuses have a deep self-actualization and self-awareness, or just a sense of knowing?
That's all part and parcel to the exercise of self-actualization, is you learn to listen to the voice of God within you, which is that still small voice. And that's the beauty of these teachings as well. They help inform you as to how to listen to that voice and how to employ its usefulness in day-to-day living.
And then you have all the science. Really, for me, has been about how do you do something which is relegated as impossibility, but is in fact very possible. It's just you have to work with nature rather than trying to dominate it with make your model fit what nature's doing. And it doesn't work that way.
No.
You have to work with nature. You have to realize you're a part of it. It's
Yep.
something that is you. You can't take an organism out of its environment and expect it to act naturally anymore. And we're the same way. We've invented our own habitat, and it contributes to that spiritual crisis that Matt was talking about. We're trying to make sense of this world that we've made, and we're the ones who's responsible for it.
Yeah, our antipathy to nature is like the source of all of our neurosis, I believe. And I was wondering, that reminds me, have you ever heard of that guy Sadhguru? Have you ever heard of him?
Sounds familiar.
He's a mystic from India, but he doesn't claim any religion. He doesn't claim Hinduism or any other religion, but he's pretty bright, and he had this talk that was so good about. It's on YouTube somewhere. It's basically called like a scientist versus a mystic,
Mm-hmm.
and he just, like, for an hour, he just politely just destroys the scientist, and
Well, it's not that hard to do, believe it or not.
I mean, it's really good. Like, it's brilliant the way he does it, and I've sent it out to a lot of people, very scientifically minded people, and it's weird. They don't like it. They don't know what to say.
I like I like what Matt says, or actually it was his wife Lori said that you have to plant seeds, not forests. In other words,
Yeah.
you can't shove an entirely new cosmology into someone's head just by using, words in a 15-minute amount of time. It really does take a lot of work, and you have to really want to learn it. If you crack open Atomic Suicide and you can't put it down and you just say, I got to just read all of this, then you're in the right state of mind to really be willing to let go of old concepts that don't really have any relation to nature at all.
This is the end of part 1. Please continue on to part 2. Thank you.